All right, it's 2 minutes past, so maybe we'll kick off. Um, so um, welcome everyone. It's great to have you along on this session. Interesting topic, especially given everything that's going on in the world at the moment. So let's introduce ourselves. My name's Greg Eder. I work with Peter Berry Consulting, so we're proud to be hosting this session. I'm a principal consultant. For those of you that haven't come across me before, I'm a registered psychologist. I trained here in New Zealand, dare I say it, back in the 80s. I sort of moved from university. I spent 10 years in the military as a psychologist, and then have gone backwards and forwards for the rest of my career consulting, doing this kind of work, and working in-house for law firms. So I've worked for a couple of law firms here in New Zealand and a couple of firms in Australia. So I got trained in the Hogan back in 2001. So I've been using it for a long time, and I've used it in all sorts of settings, in all sorts of environments, and in all sorts of ways. So that's probably enough about me. Krista, welcome. It's great to have you along. We're very pleased to have your contribution here. I'll let you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Greg. 2001, that's a long, long time. I think I first took my first Hogan assessment in 2008.
Yeah.
And I was working at a management consulting firm in Shanghai, China. And I've actually lived in China longer than anywhere else in my adult life. But I joined Hogan in 2013. And so I've been at Hogan for quite a while. And I now manage the Asia Pacific markets for Hogan Assessment. So I like to joke that it's everywhere from India to New Zealand and all the markets in between. So that's what I take care of. But I am not a registered psychologist. I actually have my master's degree in organizational development and change, and I'm currently doing my PhD in the same. So I am really happy to be here today virtually. I am really sad. I was going to take a trip to New Zealand, but unfortunately, a few thing fell through. So we'll still have to plan that. But I'm really
Mm.
excited to be talking about this topic today. This is really a topic that's really like the passion topic for me. I love talking about diversity and of course personality. I've been at Hogan for this is my 12th year now, so we think that this is very important and can be very impactful for helping your organization succeed. So we love this topic.
Mm. Yeah, and it's great to have you here, Krista. Very excited about this topic, and yeah, hope to see you here in person in the not too distant future.
Yes,
So,
I really want to go.
okay, so let's get into it. So this session this afternoon's broadly in three topics across three sort of topics. So we thought it'd be useful to perhaps provide paint a bit of context. So we're going to talk about some kind of current themes in the diversity, equity, inclusion sort of space more generally. Then we're going to sort of turn more specifically to Hogan, talk about some of the implications that Hogan has in this DEI space, and then a couple of case studies that illustrate different ways that you can use the Hogan assessments. So each case study has taken a slightly different approach. So it gives you a couple of different insights into perspectives and ways you can get an understanding of what's going on in a team. And then all going well, if we don't talk too much, especially me, we'll have a bit of time for Q&A towards the end. So a little bit about PBC. So PBC, for those of you who haven't come across PBC, it was founded in 1990 by Peter Berry, and it's been running now for our 35th year. So and we offer HR services across the full life cycle. We are the proud distributors of Hogan assessments, both in Australia and more recently in New Zealand. But very research-based organisation, and that I think is part of the affinity that we have with Hogan, which is a strong research-based organisation too. But otherwise, we offer services right across the full spectrum of coaching, selection, but in particular leadership, and of course teams, which is what we're here to talk about today. So Krista, I'll hand over to you. Tell us a little bit more about Hogan.
Yes, well, Hogan is so proud to have PBC as a distributor here in New Zealand and in the Australian markets. From our global model, we actually go through distributors in our global markets. We don't have a physical office anywhere outside the U.S. Our headquarters is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but we go through distributors around the globe to bring Hogan to the many markets that we're in. We have assessment data from over 180 different markets around the globe. We have one of the most robust representative norms out there. Our assessments have over 50 different languages. So we truly are a global company, and we actually have award-winning translation process. So if you're ever curious about how the assessments work in different languages, we can share more on that for sure. But currently, we have over 66 different markets that we are active in. Some of those markets cover additional countries, which is how we get the 180 country mark for the data. And then we have 200 partners worldwide and 55 distributors who are really who we consider Hogan on the ground in different markets. So PBC New Zealand is so key to our strategy and what we're doing in the New Zealand market, and so key to making sure that we are considering what's going on in the local markets and making sure that we're representative of what's going on in New Zealand.
Okay, thanks. So I thought it'd be useful just to provide a bit of context in the New Zealand situation in the DEI space. So I wanted to talk a little bit more generally about both gender, especially, and ethnic representation in New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand is one of those countries in the world that has always done pretty well in this space. And you can see here that the latest World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap report had us sitting at 5th position out of 100 different countries. So we've always, except for 1 year and about 10 years ago, where we slipped off out of the top 10, New Zealand's always been in the top 10. For the last few years, we've been in the top 4. For some reason, we've slipped back to 5, partly I think because Great Britain somehow, which hadn't even been in the top 10, suddenly appeared as number 4 this year. So, but more specifically, we see if we look at the female representation in leadership, it's about 1/3 of women. 1/3 of those positions are occupied by women. So, you know, we should be looking at more 50%, give or take, given the gender split in the country. Ethnic representation in senior leadership's another interesting statistic. This statistic here is drawn primarily from the public sector, where we do a reasonably good job of representation, but again, it's still behind the mark. If you look at this is a combined percentage of Māori, Pacifica, and Asian people. The population generally is about, I think, is made up of about 44% of that particular combination. So we're a bit behind the 8 ball there. And the gender pay gap, still 8.6%. It's better than in a lot of countries, but it's still obviously a gap. So you know, that's some positive news. Perhaps on the other side of the coin, some of the less positive things that have been going on, and we see, you know, recently an executive order that came out of the White House in the US at the beginning of the year, wanting to sort of change federal practices to remove anything around in the D&I space. So quite a dramatic kind of move that we've seen there. A recent piece of research in Australia pointed to the fact that, you know, there's a small minority of people who are actively opposed to D&I initiatives, and that number's increasing slightly. Still a pretty small number, but it's perhaps, you know, a bit of a concern that the number's increasing. And here in New Zealand, you know, we've had people like Winston Peters talking about putting a bill up to end these so-called woke left-wing social engineering of diversity targets in the public sector. So there are a few things going on all around the world that perhaps aren't helping when it comes to the DEI landscape. So in terms of why are we interested in this? Well, you know, we thought about this, and we thought, well, broadly speaking, there's perhaps two buckets of rationale that might contribute to why you might invest in DEI initiatives. The first is perhaps the ethical bucket. It's just the right thing to do, to give people in any minority group greater voice. The diversity that we know brings those people with that alternative voice, gives wider diverse thinking, enables teams to perform better, and there is some functional value in that too. And I think that the evidence is starting to amount that there's a lot that is contributed. You can see some of those factors there, a combination of both the ethical, the functional, increased things like reduced turnover, more innovative thinking, better customer experience. So there are definite advantages to DEI initiatives and what they bring to business. In terms of thinking about diversity, well, one simple definition here is diversity is any attribute that another person might use to detect individual differences. So we've used this analogy here. It's a little bit like an iceberg, that there are several visible differences like gender, race, age, ethnicity, physical attributes that people see, but there are a whole raft of other less visible attributes that can contribute to that diverse picture. What we've done here is I've highlighted the three blue things in the top right-hand corner of that table there. You can see cognitive style, affective disposition or sort of mood or temperament or personality characteristics, and motivational factors, which taps in on those sort of values drivers. So those are the things that we, as a people consulting psychometric sort of business, are thinking about. Now, when it comes to, so the next couple of slides are a bit nerdy, but I'm sure many of you will have seen the notion of a normal distribution. Now, in an ideal world, it'd be great if we could say, well, people with this characteristic are completely separate from another group, and we can make very definitive conclusions, and there's no overlap. And if you're in this group, you do well, and if you're in this group, you don't, whatever that group might be. In reality, that's not actually how things tend to work. In reality, what we see is that those two distributions tend to overlap. So even though you might see a difference between the average scores of two groups, there's an overlap. So some people in one group might score lower than the average in the other group, and there'll be others in the first group that score higher than the average of the other group. So I don't confuse you too much in that, but it complicates matters. It's not as simple as saying if you're in this group, you'll do well, and if you're in this group, you won't, because there's always overlap. And that's the reality. So if you take that to the next step, when you look at personality and start getting into the science of individual differences, this is where, as psychometricians, this is where we kind of really get to the interesting stuff. In an ideal world, you might see a curve that looks a bit like the one that you can see there with that, everything's sort of hovering around the predicted relationship, but they're always outliers. Now, some statisticians would say, oh, we don't like that because it messes up our data. But as psychologists and psychometricians and anybody interested in personality, this is actually where the gems sit. Because it's these individuals who sit outside of that relationship that can add unique value. And so that's our argument, is that those individuals who are diverse in thinking actually contribute a lot to a team's effectiveness. So we're going to build on that idea a bit more. So just perhaps to highlight a little bit of the research that sits behind this. McKinsey put out a paper every year. They've consistently shown that organizations that manage their diversity well, so in this case, companies with top quartile gender, ethnic diversity in their executive teams, outperform those companies in the bottom quartile financially by nearly 40%. But there is research, and we've got a couple of papers here, one from the early 2000s and one just from last year, 20 years apart, finding similar things. These were both meta-analyses, so research that combines a whole set of, hundreds of articles. And what was found both back in the early 2000s and even more recently is that for every article that shows there is a positive benefit, there might be some other research that shows there's not. So they kind of balance each other out, which kind of gives us this kind of messy picture of what actually is contributing to better performance. And so the way this works is that if you think about from an information processing point of view, which in an ideal world, diversity gives access to a range of backgrounds, a range of networks, information, different ways of thinking. And if we can lean into all of those things without being prejudiced, or the unconscious bias is getting in the way, that's a great way to approach things. But the reality is that's not actually what happens. Things like, the similarity, the affinity that we feel for people who might look like us, or sound like us, or live like us, will get in the way of whether or not we take what they have to say as valuable. Similarly, there's the whole notion of in-group, out-group. If you're a member of the in-group, then you might be more akin or more pro towards accepting what people in that group are thinking, and you might be a little bit more averse to what people outside of your group think. So when you put all of that together, we're finding that the observable differences can actually sometimes impede performance, while less visible differences, like personality, can actually be associated with performance increments. And so rather than a carte blanche approach to the value that diversity might bring, what the research has found is that sometimes the best benefits of diversity can be found in particular areas or particular ways. So, and in particular, Woolridge, who were some of the researchers that I talked about in that couple of slides back, the meta-analysis, they found that actually, especially in the areas of things like creativity, innovation, solving complex problems, that's where diversity could be really found to be quite helpful and quite useful. So that's a little bit about some of the background. You talked about a bit about the DE&I space, some of the research, what that's showing us, some kind of mixed findings, but pointing to the fact that certain characteristics actually, diversity can really be quite helpful if we lean into that. So I'm going to hand over to Krista now to take us a bit further on some of that thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this presentation is about both teams and diversity and the importance of diversity across teams. Just a little bit of information on teams. A few months ago, we were actually researching more about this, and I was very surprised to find out that participation in teams is growing. And I had no idea, but in 1987, really only 28% of employees in the Fortune 1000 companies in the US use teams significantly for at least some employees. I assume that teams have always been around and have always been the main unit of cooperation across organizations, but that's not the case. Actually, teams is something that is increasing more and more. And nowadays, we recognize that one person can't just do their job on their own. And so the majority of organizations today use teams as the basic work unit together. Additionally, we know that individuals still have their individual tasks. And so that's why we always propose it's worthwhile looking at how the individual differs from others on the team, their strengths and weaknesses, and how they compare to others across the team or across the organization. But more importantly, because we know that at least over half of individuals also spend a significant part of their day working together in teams, it's really important to understand that person in the team and understand the group dynamics and the team dynamics if you're thinking about performance. And this is another interesting fact that I think a lot of organizations miss, which is whenever we're thinking about how we can get teams to work together better, to be more high performing, really the first step that most organizations take is, do they get along? Let's work on ice breaking. A lot of organizations invest significant amounts of time and energy and budgets doing these team group activities, right? And so improving social cohesion, making sure that we're getting along and understanding each other. But actually, the research suggests that happiness, or how well a team gets along, does not equal performance in a team. And so really what makes a high performing team and what makes people actually do better is winning together. And so where a lot of companies are spending all this money on, team, get to know each other's, icebreakers, doing activities that help people get along better, what organizations should actually be focusing on is performance. And if there's one thing we leave with you today, it's really that focus on performance in an equal and diverse way. That is what is actually going to make diversity work on a team. And it's also what's going to make your organization succeed and win against the competition. Going on to the next slide, one quote that the quote from the White House, Greg, was so interesting because it was talking about how we're not going to do DEI anymore. We're only going to focus on performance and people who are qualified. And what's hilarious about that is if we actually focused only on performance and take away all of the other factors, it should increase diversity. It should increase fairness. But the fact of the matter is there's all of those other factors that you mentioned, Greg, similarity effect, implicit leader theory, where I'm going to always hire and promote people who look like me, right? These all are in the background. So if you're not proactively thinking about diversity, you're actually being biased. And so that's where that quote from the White House, I think, is a reaction to the focus on diversity only and not the focus on performance and diversity. So you need both of them in order to be really successful. Some of our research here, I'd like to share some of the research that we have on personality assessment and how it relates to diversity. I like to say that Hogan does discriminate, but only against performance. And so it's not discriminating against gender, against different people groups. It's actually discriminating against anyone who is not a high performer. And our goal at Hogan is to make it easier for higher performers to get the job or to get promoted. We want the good people in the good roles, right? We want people in roles that are suitable for them and in which they're going to be successful. But we also want to make it more difficult for poor performers to get the job or to get the promotion. And I think this is where a lot of people who are anti-DEI, anti-diversity are very scared that we're going to be focusing on putting people who are not qualified, putting people who don't deserve the role and taking away these roles from people who actually deserve them. And so that I don't agree with that type of thinking, but I think what is worthwhile considering is focusing more on performance and using personality to see who's going to be the high performer in the job will actually naturally increase that diversity and equity and inclusion in these areas. And so really, if you are using a valid and reliable personality assessment, it offers opportunities for anyone to be a high performer. And it's not going to just promote people who are already similar and who are already going to get the role. Again, it's that focus on performance when people are high performing in the role, and we want to limit the people who are not performing well from getting those jobs. And that will naturally lead to diversity. So you can use Hogan. I don't know, many people maybe in this webinar are familiar with Hogan. But if not, we really have 3 core assessments we have here. The HPI is what we consider the bright side of personality. This is similar to some of the other personality assessments that are out there in the market. It's based on the 5-factor model. Hogan has tweaked it a bit to focus more on performance with the scale of ambition or drive. And so we measure the bright side of personality. So it really answers the question, can you do the job? In what ways are you going to really excel at the job? And maybe even what job will you be good at doing? The second aspect we look at is someone's values. We call this the motives, values, preferences inventory. These are someone's personal goals, interest drivers. From a leadership perspective, it's, what kind of culture will a leader create for their team? Will they like the job, but also what are they going to prioritize as a leader? And then with the HDS, these are what we call our derailers or the dark side. And these are the overused strengths that will get in the way of success. All of these are related to job performance. And again, today, we want to make sure that the focus for teams, for promoting diversity is on performance, because we know that with personality, there's no discrimination against different groups. And so you can use it as a very fair way to promote people and see who should be doing the job and what job should they be doing. If you have them in a job that's not right for them, maybe they're not going to be successful, and that will also create some conflict. But if you put people in the right roles that will be suitable for them, what they're going to be really good at, then you'll be able to create a really high performing team. So within trying to increase diversity and promoting fairness, if you are using, again, those 3 assessments, they are predictive of performance. And this is a topic I'm going to continue to say over and over again. This is such a critical component of fairness because they help ensure you are selecting individuals who can perform the job. And it's also important because there are some assessments out there that do not discriminate based on individual differences, but they do also not help predict performance. And so if you're not helping to identify qualified candidates who can perform well, it can be frustrating for their team. So if you're just saying this person has these characteristics, but it doesn't predict how well they're going to do on the job, then that's an assessment that may not be useful for promoting DEI, even if it does not discriminate against individual differences. We've actually found that we can build personality profiles to predict overall performance with the relationship range between 0.3 to over 0.5 when combining multiple assessments. So it's really a great way to ensure that you are hiring people who will perform well. And you can look at someone's personality results. You won't be able to tell what gender they are, what race they are, what people group they come from. And so it's a really fair way to promote people based on their personality. So the second thing we'd like to highlight is that, again, it does not discriminate. And so we are not showing very many sub differences. There's no meaningful differences between subgroups. We find no meaningful differences in sex or age. And what you can see across the various graphs is that the lines almost completely overlap. And because assessments do not discriminate, all applicants have an equal, unbiased opportunity to get a job. And this will allow for increasing diversity of your workforce while focusing on performance. Now, you may be curious about what New Zealand looks like. And so we would like to share a little bit of research that we've done specifically for the New Zealand market. Today, I'm going to present data. This chart actually shows the sample sizes for each demographic group we analyzed, and for the referent group, European. I would like to point out that today I'm just going to show data from the Asian, Maori, and European group because the Pacific people group is below the 500 threshold for all 3 assessments. In order to really ensure consistency and reliability, we require 500 pieces of data before we can go and do this equivalency analysis. And so we won't really put confidence in what the data is showing. So we're still collecting information, and probably by next year, we'll be able to do a follow-up study and look at what Pacific people look like. But going on to the next slide, we have overall differences in the means between the Asian peoples, the Maori peoples, and the European peoples in New Zealand. And so this graph shows the mean differences for each Hogan scale. And you can see there's the HPI, which is the bright side, the HDS, which is the dark side, and the MVPI, which is we call the inside, per race and ethnicity. And you can see here, again, the means are extremely similar. Now, we do see a pattern of the Asian people group scoring slightly higher on average on one HPI scale, and that is the scale of prudence. And then we also see 2 HDS scales, which is bold and diligent. And then we see 5 MVPI scales, which is recognition, power, altruistic, security, and commerce. These are slightly different, but even though the differences are small, this is the input going into the assessment. When we actually create a selection profile, we also look at the output in these selection profiles to ensure fairness. And so despite these being very small differences that really won't make a big difference in actually the outcomes of the assessments, For selection projects, we always ensure that there's no discrimination in the selection profiles that we create, and we can correct for any of these small differences that might occur in the selection profile. Finally, when we're looking at the overall, all of the HPI scales together for the final output, we have found that the differential test functioning really has no differences. So according to all of the industry standards, all of the HPI, HDS, and MVPI scales are fair to use and are very accurate and representative for all race and ethnic groups assessed. So that is the good news about our assessments. Finally, as we're talking about fairness, this also, it extends to personality diversity across the organization, within a role, and on teams. And so when we're thinking about how to put together a team, we absolutely do not want to create a team of clones or an organization of clones where everyone has the same exact personality profile. And so if we are focused on improving diversity, this should include diversity of personality, diversity of thought, and a variance in the ways that people approach problems or situations. And so using personality should still allow for diversity and avoiding clones, but there are a trillion different possibilities for who we choose and who there is with regards to personality. So within a job, there will be some similarity on critical characteristics. So maybe 1 or 2 scales, or even in some instances, some subscales that we use. But we design our personality profiles to only screen the extreme ends of a few personality scales, allowing for variance across other characteristics. The other thing that's important to remember is that there are only a few scales that are important and critical for job success in most roles. And so for all of the other personality scales and characteristics, it doesn't matter what they look like. You might have a role that prudence or conscientiousness, being very focused to details, is very important. But what's less important is your sociability score. So for example, there may be some people who are very high on sociability and quite talkative, and other people who prefer to listen. So you'll have different team dynamics and ways of communication and thought and diversity within a role, within a team, within the organization, across the organization. So it's very important to consider this. And with this, I'm going to hand it back to Greg. I think we're pretty soon going to go into talking more about case studies for how we can include, how diversity works on a team and how you can actually help team development to increase performance. Because again, within a team, the research has shown that it's better to focus on performance, focus on getting the job done rather than focusing on getting along for high performance of teams.
Okay, thanks, Krista. So if we go back to this notion of the distribution of characteristics that you might see across a group of people, what we're looking for characteristics that sit across the spectrum. To Krista's point, there might be some characteristics where we're saying this is going to be quite important for a particular job, but there'll be other characteristics where people could sit right across the breadth of the spectrum. So, and we can see that when if we look at this, we'll look at a couple of case studies now. So this first case study is looking at a tech startup. So we started working with this company a couple of years ago, and they've got a wealth of data. You can see, you'll see shortly on one of the slides that I'll show you. We've got a wealth of data from people that have been recruited using Hogan assessments from the start of their startup. But they had some issues with staff retention. There was something going on between holding on to some of the staff. And trying to understand what was sitting behind that, and then trying to understand some of the issues and what they could do to manage those issues. So to do what we did here, as you can see, so sometimes what we'll do is we'll produce these line graphs, which this looks incredibly complicated, doesn't it? But it just goes to show the diversity of what you're seeing. This is looking at the organizational values assessment, so the MVPI. You can see people from all over the place on most of these scales. High scores, low scores. And then what we've done is we've looked at the averages for the staff in the blue line, and then for the executive leadership team in the, I'm colorblind, I can even remember what the color that is, orange, is it orange or green? That other color. And you can see that for most of this, there's some quite striking similarities. If you look at some of the higher scores, so the couple of peaks, you can see there that, not surprisingly, being a tech startup, this score here around in the science domain, which is the kind of technology focus, the kind of logical, rational data orientation of people, both ELT and staff in general, that's a really strong characteristic. You can't quite see it, but there's a black line. You might see a little bit of it just in behind the blue line. So we've got. Oh, I think I've turned those off. The other elevated score sits around altruism. So the nature of this tech business was wanting to do something that helps people, something for the greater good, giving back, community orientation. There was a difference though, and you can see quite a stark difference here in the security scale in the MVPI. And security is about people's comfort with risk. So not surprisingly, the ELT were quite comfortable with risk. So as that score gets lower, people are more comfortable with taking a few risks, being a little bit less structured and organized, whereas the staff were higher on this. They were a bit more oriented around getting stuff done. As the score gets higher, some insecurity, you find people a bit more perhaps action-oriented, a bit more risk-averse though. So that was one of the differences that we saw with the looking at the ELT and the staff. So one of the things that the leadership team decided to do was to make sure that they gave staff more of a heads up on what was going on, give them a clearer picture of what the future looked like, because some of them were getting anxious about the stability of their jobs, and they were worried that they might lose their job in some cases, and that was contributing to their staff retention problem. So what we then decided to do was, okay, well, let's have a closer look at the leadership team. So we produced exactly the same process, but just a smaller group of people. So we've got about half a dozen people here. So this is the profile for on the HPI, so the bright side personality. And you can see when you look at this, again, quite a wide range of scales that we're seeing here, quite a range of scores across the breadth of the scales. If you look at particularly adjustment and interpersonal sensitivity, you can see scores going from, well up into the 90s, and you've got one person who scored 100, so the highest score in the benchmark, through to people who are scoring, right down in the last sort of bottom 2 or 3% of the population. So a big range there, which worked quite well. The group was quite sensitive. They had their sensitive, caring folk, and they had their other sort of tougher taskmasters who kind of call a spade. That's the interpersonal sensitivity. And then adjustment tells us a little bit about people's comfort with risk. So higher scores are a bit more comfortable with risk. They don't feel so anxious about things, whereas low scores get a bit more worried. So the team could kind of balance each other out and sort of draw on some of those comparative differences. If we look at some of there's a couple of clusters that are going on here. So you can see, not surprisingly, the group, they're all leadership group, they're all pretty high on ambition. So quite action-oriented, have a sense of the future, driven, want to do well. And so the whole group was fairly driven in that sense. If we look at inquisitive, again, it's a tech startup. So a group of mostly very creative, innovative people. And then this prudence scale here, this is this measure of conscientiousness. So it ties in a little bit with the security scale that we see in the MVPI. Often when you have a lower score for security, there's often a lower score for prudence. People are more comfortable with change, more ambiguity, don't need a lot of structure and process. So, and again, that's what you'd expect with a leadership team in a tech startup. But what's interesting here is there's a couple of outliers. So, and you can see that there was one person, different people, one person who had a lower score on inquisitive. So they're a bit more pragmatic. They're sort of thinking, hang on a minute, these ideas are all wonderful, but how are we going to make this work? And then at the same time, we had another person who was quite high on prudence. So they were constantly going back to, yeah, that's all very nice, but what's the process? We need a process. See, what steps are we going to take to make this happen? So this is interesting from the leadership team's point of view, because it helps highlight the value that those two individuals bring. And if what you'll see here is, in the team setting, we might have put the names alongside each of these, but I don't know who those people are. I don't know how old they are. I don't know what their ethnicity is. I don't know what their gender is. But I can say, whoever they were, those people had something unique to contribute and bring to the team. And that's, though, to Krista's earlier point, psychometrics are blind to your gender, to your age, to your race. So those two people had a lot to bring. And if the team recognized the contribution that they make, then that could produce a good outcome. So so in terms of results, it meant that the leadership team had a better understanding of the staff's concerns. They were able to provide more sensitive communications about the future outlook for the business, give people a bit more certainty and a bit more comfort that, things are going well, don't worry about your job, sort of deal. So that reduced staff turnover. Also, it helped improve delivery, because the team was able to take advantage of recognizing that they were sometimes not that organized and getting stuff done, and that enhanced their funding. So the startup was also looking for government funding, and once they started to produce a bit more, it meant that they had a better chance of getting further funding, which is one of the issues that people were worried about, was that they weren't getting stuff out. That meant that they weren't being able to demonstrate how they were using the existing funding, which is what people were worried about in terms of their jobs and their job certainty. So that's one way of thinking about it, using this particular model, using these sort of line graphs. Now I'm going to hand over to Krista to tell us a different sort of approach to understanding teams, using a slightly different methodology for getting a picture of how the team operates together. So, Krista. Oh, you're on mute.
So sorry. Absolutely. For the second case study, we wanted to share about this global supplier that we worked with in New Zealand. And so this was a global supplier that had a new CEO. He had a strong mandate to actually double the size of the business to $1 billion within the next 5 years. This was a huge shift. And of course, it required that he have new skills, develop his team with new skills in acquisition, in global marketing, of course, on the data science side with logistics. The team would also have to lead a very deeply skeptical and science-based organization into a future with much higher expectations than was before. And so what this CEO did was started developing a new executive team. And so for the CEO, one of the things that he decided to do with the new executive team is to give each team member a Hogan assessment, and then also do a team report to look at the aggregate scores of the team together. So going on to the next slide, we understand that people oftentimes play two roles. So you have your functional role. So you're either CEO, the global logistics lead, maybe you're the head of R&D, but they also have their psychological role based on their personality. And so this might be their ability to generate ideas, or to hustle and get things done, or to drive for results, or think about ways that we can get those results done. And our research team shows that typically on leadership teams, they tend to be dominant, outgoing, really results focused. However, we also know the drawback of that is that can hinder the development of psychological safety and an overarching goal, and key conditions for performance. So it actually, with this team's results, it actually proved that the team was excellent at driving for results. However, they were low on process. So they really set high, lofty goals. They clarified roles. They set a vision. They had even the charisma to get that done. However, they were not concerned with the process. They didn't handhold. They expected their teams to figure out how to get everything done. Well, this is one aspect of the team report. The second thing we looked at was, of course, the HDS, or the dark side. And so this team together had really distinctive shared dark side. And they had really the risk of being what we call colorful, or dramatic or distractible under stress and pressure. One thing I would like to point is if you look at the slide here, even though the team had this reputation, so more than half of the team members actually scored moderate high to high on this, we do see that there is diversity in the team. So not every team member had that, which is why it's important to both assess individual personality and then look at the team personality as well. Within this, we saw that the organization saw the impact of this team's reputation of being high on colorful. Just like the board wanted, they drove for results. The team was really strongly goal-driven, competitive, ambitious. The organization felt as if immediately they got a boost of energy because the executive team increased the targets, they raised the standards, and a lot of people who were low performing actually exited. They also held individuals more to account and made sure that people were actually performing. And even though the team was exciting to be around and the team made strong efforts to connect with each other and the wider organization, there was some behaviors that this team exhibited that were actually causing problem and frustration and resentment, especially with the teams that they managed. And so even though this team was driven and focused, the team really didn't listen well to other teams across the organization, especially the people who reported to them. A lot of times they spent their they spent a lot of their time broadcasting, and again, this is where the colorful that derailer comes into place. So they were bringing attention to what they were doing, making sure that everyone knew about everything that they were doing. However, they also tended to have lots of different types of goals, pet projects, and do things that started to add to confusion and distract from the main goals that they were trying to accomplish. And so the CEO started to finally understand that this was problematic. So within the team report, he gave the executive team a leadership development session. Before that, he gave them individual team feedbacks. And then he worked with the team as a whole to improve their to stop this bad behavior of trying to broadcast what they're doing, not listening, and to also stop these pet projects that were going on and all these distractions that the leadership team tended to have. But they also started working on specific skills and routines to help the leadership team stay constructive. And additionally, what the leader did was looked at the individual profiles and saw how it differed from the team report and how they could actually use those skills to become more effective and help the team become more effective. So if we actually go to the slide before, we see, or the previous slide, yes, so we see that the majority of the team was results focused, but only a quarter of the team was focused on process. So even though the majority of the team was not focused on process, what the CEO did is actually worked with the quarter of the team, the 25% that were process focused, to be able to put in place processes and help build the structure that was needed to support the results. And so he worked with the individuals, but also the different team members who had strengths that the rest of the team lacked to help the team become more diverse, and also to help the team become more high performing in that aspect. So the results of this is after 2 years, the organization really became strong. Number one, this actually helped to accelerate the onboarding for the new leader. It also helped him become aware of, connect what was going on with the organization with actually the team's reputation at the higher level. Number two, it helped to enhance the team decision making. So when they actually made decisions about what priorities they should have, they recognized that they had the tendency to be distractible and not focused on the process. And so they put that forefront in mind when they were making decisions, what decisions could actually be implemented versus which are too aggressive for the organization. And then the third thing is, after this 2-year process, it really helped the business succeed, and the CEO accomplished the goal even a year sooner than the board had. They said they had a 5-year goal of doubling the business. He actually doubled it in 4 years. And so this was actually very successful case study that shows how you can look at the team results and then work with the diversity on the team to help the team become more high performing. So in summary, I think we talked about a lot of things today, but we absolutely recognize that the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes belonging is in there, has been slowly but surely plugging along. However, there are challenges, especially in today's environment, where people are pushing back against the idea that diversity should be something that we focus on. And we would like to challenge that by saying we still have to focus on diversity. Let's not forget that, but let's focus on performance and diversity. You can't have one without the other. We know that there are very ethical and functional reasons to value diversity. As Greg shared, there are a lot of studies that show the importance of diversity. We also know from an ethical standpoint, it's the right thing to do. Diversity equals individual differences, including personality, and personality is actually one individual difference that is fair. Discriminate against low performance, don't discriminate against different people groups, different genders, or different races. We know that diversity can enhance group performance. However, let's be realistic. If you're hiring people who are completely different from each other, it can also prompt conflict. And so working on the balance between making sure that we are hiring diversity of personality, for example, but also focusing on how you can use those differences to achieve something bigger is where the focus should be on. If you're only focusing on getting along, that could even potentially enhance that conflict. But if you focus on a shared goal, then people actually will start to get along naturally. And 5, the last thing is personality can contribute to diversity while reducing selection bias. So we'd highly consider you using a valid and reliable personality assessment that does research on New Zealand and making sure that it's fair for New Zealand as well in your practice as best practices. So thank you, everyone.
So we've got a few minutes left. So I should have, my bad. I should have been asking you to write any questions in the chat box. But perhaps if you, what we could do is, I don't think we're going to do justice to any questions in just a few minutes because, but if you have got questions, put them in the chat box. And we will respond to them separately. So what we'll do is, for those that were at the session, we will produce a Q&A document to help address any questions you've got. So feel free to pop those into the chat box now, and we can respond to those separately with a follow-up email. But what I also like to do is give I'm going to give Krista the chance to talk about a piece of really fantastic research that Hogan are doing that I'd really love to have you all involved in. So I will hand back to Krista to talk to that.
Yes, and we will also share this in the email that we send. But Hogan is really dedicated to conducting research in local markets. And so we have launched a global research study on effective leadership, and we want to hear from you about what effective leadership looks like in New Zealand. And so our goal is to get 200 participants from each market so that we're fairly representative of what people in that market say contribute to good leadership. But essentially, this is a survey. It is 15 minutes. We know that it is a very thorough survey, but we would really appreciate your input so that we can hear what you think would make for an effective leader. We have a great question here. Do you need to be a leader to take part in the study? No, absolutely not. In fact, as long as you have been led by a leader, if you've had a boss before, then you are qualified to take this survey. We don't just want to hear what leaders think about what would make for an effective leader. We actually want to hear what followers think about what would make an effective leader. We think that is very important in understanding what people want out of their leadership. And so we really hope to include New Zealand as part of this study and the results from New Zealand. So please feel free to take the survey yourself, share with your friends, families, anyone else at your organization. We would love to hear your voice.
Yeah, and I see one person's asked a question, do you need to be a leader to take part in the study? So I think Krista's already answered that one, Jess. But yeah, and look, yeah, I would add you really endorse that, Krista's pitch there. It's a piece of research that we'd love to see what New Zealanders think of leadership, especially Māori leadership. So if you there is part of the demographics that we're collecting is information around Māori leadership. So if we've got any Māori leaders on the call or Māori people on the call who can talk about Māori leadership and that particular perspective, we'd really love to hear from you, especially. And once just another point, we're going to send you this link in an email. If you want to send it to other people, we would love you to do that too. We'll thank you forever. Don't hesitate to get peers or friends or colleagues to complete it. The more, the better. So look, we've got a couple of minutes to go. So as I say, I don't think we're going to have the chance to answer any questions. But I hope you found that interesting. I hope you've got some value out of it. Des and I are more than happy to talk to you at any point. If you've got any questions, anything else you want to kind of understand a bit more about, don't hesitate to get in touch. So on that note, I'll thank Krista for all your fantastic input and knowledge in this space. Really pleased that you could contribute, and we look forward to seeing you in person at sometime in the near future. And for those of you that are here in New Zealand and in Auckland especially, get a chance to meet her face to face. So
yes, I love that. Well, and thank you, Greg, for all of your wonderful insights, and to PBC New Zealand for hosting this amazing webinar.
Okay, folks. Well, thanks very much. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I hope it doesn't rain yet, but yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you.